In Studio 3 Amperes at Harpo Productions, a soft-spoken martial artist turned actor was about to face a question that could shake his faith before millions. What began as a routine talk show segment about faith and power turned deadly serious when the queen of television herself, Oprah Winfrey, challenged him live on air about whether God helped him win his fights. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical celebrity guest. For decades, he had been an Air Force veteran, world karate champion, and action icon, known for turning stoic silence into strength and faith into motion. When Oprah asked, "Do you really believe God helps you win fights?" she had no idea she was walking into the quiet gravity of a man who had faced darkness, doubt, and death, and found peace instead of pride. Norris's calm, piercing response would trigger a wave of stunned silence across the studio, transforming daytime television into an unexpected masterclass on humility, purpose, and power. What began as a talk show interview would become a televised awakening. The audience at Harpo Productions and millions watching around the world would never see Faith or Chuck Norris the same way again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The applause swelled through Studio 3 Amperes at Harpo Productions like a living thing. Red lights blinked on cameras that glided silently across the polished floor. Technicians with headsets whispered commands. The energy was unmistakable, electric anticipation buzzing through a sea of bodies that filled every available seat. We're back in 3, 2. The floor director pointed, and the audience erupted. On cue. Oprah Winfrey leaned forward in her chair, radiating the warm confidence that had made her America's most trusted confidant. Her burgundy suit caught the studio lights perfectly, her smile both genuine and practiced, the result of years mastering the delicate balance between authenticity and entertainment. "Welcome back," she said, her voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and intimacy. "Today on our Faith and Power special, we're exploring how spiritual beliefs shape the lives of public figures." The camera panned across her guests, a pop star known for religious controversy, Brother Samuel Miller, a soft-spoken minister from Chicago's South Side, and Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, action star, and increasingly vocal Christian. Chuck sat quietly at the end of the sofa arrangement. Unlike many celebrities who commanded attention through animated gestures or carefully crafted sound bites, he projected a different kind of presence. His posture was straight but relaxed, hands resting comfortably on his knees. His famous beard was neatly trimmed, eyes clear and focused. He wore a simple dark blazer over a button-down shirt, no flashy accessories, no calculated image, just a man comfortable in his own skin. "Chuck," Oprah turned toward him, "you've become more outspoken about your faith in recent years. That's not always the easiest path in Hollywood." Chuck nodded, the slightest smile crossing his face. "It's not about easy paths, Oprah. It's about true ones." His voice was quieter than many expected. The man who roundhouse kicked his way through countless films spoke with measured calm, almost gentle in its delivery. The audience leaned forward slightly, straining to catch every word. "My faith isn't separate from who I am," he continued. "It shapes my discipline as a martial artist, my choices as an actor, how I treat the people around me." A few audience members exchanged glances. Some nodded appreciatively. Others seemed to find his earnestness slightly quaint, a relic of an older, less cynical America. A faint ripple of polite laughter floated from the back row. Brother Samuel watched Chuck with quiet recognition, a man who understood what it meant to hold convictions in a world that often preferred performance over principle. Oprah sensed it too. 20 years hosting America's most influential talk show had given her an uncanny ability to read a room, to feel the subtle currents of emotion flowing beneath surface reactions. She recognized something genuine in Chuck's demeanor, something beyond the practiced responses most celebrities offered. "That's fascinating," she said, crossing her legs and adjusting her position. The subtle shift in her posture didn't go unnoticed by the director, who had worked with her long enough to recognize when Oprah was transitioning from light conversation to something deeper. "Let's talk about that connection between faith and your career," she said, her gaze intensifying slightly. "Because that's where many of us struggle reconciling spiritual beliefs with worldly success." The pop star beside Chuck jumped in with a practiced response about balancing religious roots with artistic expression. The audience responded warmly to the familiar narrative. Brother Samuel added thoughtful comments about finding purpose beyond material gain. But throughout these exchanges, Oprah's attention kept returning to Chuck. Something about his stillness, his lack of performance, intrigued her. In an industry built on carefully constructed personas, his quiet authenticity stood out like silence in a storm. The segment producer checked his watch, making a subtle gesture toward the director. 15 minutes until the next commercial break time to build toward a moment that would keep viewers from changing channels. Oprah nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding the cue without needing to look. 20 years in television had taught her the rhythm of creating memorable television. She turned again to Chuck, her expression shifting to the 1 millions of viewers recognized the look that preceded her most penetrating questions. "Chuck," she began, leaning slightly forward, "your career has been defined by physical strength, by fighting even if it's choreographed for the screen." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "I'm curious about how you reconcile that with your faith." The studio seemed to quiet, as though the audience could sense the conversation moving from surface to depth. Chuck met Oprah's gaze steadily, neither defensive nor eager to respond. He simply waited for the actual question. Oprah continued, "Because there's an interesting contradiction there, isn't there? Between the humility taught in Christianity and the power you've come to symbolize on screen." Chuck nodded slightly, acknowledging the thoughtfulness behind her observation. The camera zoomed in on his face, catching the subtle contemplation in his eyes. The director signaled for a tight shot of Oprah's expression, curious, challenging but respectful. The silence stretched just long enough for the audience to feel the weight of what was coming. Oprah took a breath, her question crystallizing into its most direct form. No one in the studio realized they were about to witness one of the most powerful, unscripted moments in the show's history. "Do you really believe God helps you win fights?" Oprah's question cut through the studio air with precision. The words themselves were simple, but their delivery curious, slightly incredulous, tinged with challenge, transformed them into something more provocative. She leaned forward slightly, her body language a perfect complement to the intellectual challenge she'd posed. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. On the surface, there was something inherently amusing about the image. Chuck Norris, legendary tough guy, asking for divine intervention before throwing a roundhouse kick. A few audience members exchanged amused glances, expecting a quick, perhaps self-deprecating response. In the third row, a woman whispered to her friend, just loudly enough to be heard by those nearby, "Can you imagine? Dear Lord, help me kick this guy's butt." More chuckles followed. But Chuck didn't laugh. His expression remained utterly still. Not angry, not defensive, just completely present. His breathing remained measured and deep, his posture unchanged. The only noticeable shift was in his eyes, which seemed to look both at Oprah and somehow beyond her at the same time. There was a quality to his gaze that seemed to cut through the performative nature of television, through the expectations of entertainment, through the layers of celebrity that had accumulated around both of them over decades in the public eye. The laughter faded quickly, replaced by an unusual tension. A woman in the front row, who had been chuckling moments before, now straightened in her seat, her expression shifting to one of interest. The collective mood in the studio began to transform, not because Chuck had said anything, but precisely because he hadn't. In the control room, the director's finger hovered over the button that would cut to another camera angle. In 20 years of producing daytime television, he had developed an instinct for when to move away from uncomfortable moments. But something held him back, some recognition that what was unfolding wasn't awkward silence but something deeper, something worth capturing. "Stay on them both," he murmured to the camera operators. "Two shot. Then be ready for reactions." Oprah, masterful at navigating uncomfortable silences, felt a rare uncertainty. She'd expected either humor or a practiced response about faith-giving strength. Chuck's silence was neither defensive nor performative. It was authentic, in a way rarely seen under studio lights. Her typical interview rhythm faltered momentarily, as she recognized they had moved beyond the familiar territory of celebrity conversation into something more genuine. She continued, her voice softening slightly, recalibrating her approach. "There's a question of ego there, isn't there? The line between asking for God's guidance and claiming divine favor when you overpower someone else?" She gestured expressively, her hands framing the philosophical complexity of what she was asking. Another soft murmur moved through the audience, some nodding in agreement with Oprah's framing, others shifting uncomfortably. A middle-aged man in a business suit uncrossed his legs, then crossed them again, seemingly unsure how to physically position himself during this unexpected turn in the conversation. Two college-aged women in the back exchanged a glance that suggested they were witnessing something they hadn't anticipated when they'd secured tickets to the show. Brother Samuel watched the exchange with growing interest, his fingers lightly pressed together as though in unconscious prayer. His earlier anonymity in the shadow of the two bigger celebrities had suited him, but now his attentiveness marked him as an important witness to what was unfolding. The camera caught his expression briefly thoughtful, expectant, as though he recognized the contours of authentic spiritual dialogue emerging within the unlikely context of a talk show. The pop star beside Chuck shifted uncomfortably. Unused to moments that couldn't be filled with charm or deflection, he glanced at his watch, then immediately regretted the gesture, aware it might be caught on camera and seem dismissive. He straightened his posture, trying to look engaged, but the contrast between his practiced celebrity demeanor and Chuck's authentic presence only highlighted the unusual nature of what was happening. Chuck's silence continued, filling the studio with a tension that was neither hostile nor awkward, but profound. It wasn't the silence of someone searching for words or calculating a response. It was the quiet of genuine reflection of giving a serious question the consideration it deserved, rather than reaching for the nearest acceptable answer. His breathing remained steady, his hands still resting lightly on his knees. His focus, unwavering. The cameras captured the moment perfectly, Chuck's composed stillness juxtaposed with Oprah's gradually softening expression as she realized they had stumbled into a moment of unexpected depth. The director signaled for a wide shot of the audience, catching their collective attention, the usual restless energy of a studio audience replaced by focused anticipation. Somewhere in the back of the audience, a woman coughed nervously. A teenage boy who had come hoping to see the martial arts star demonstrate a kick now leaned forward, suddenly interested in something entirely different. An elderly couple in the middle section held hands without realizing it, drawn into the gravity of the moment. A camera operator glanced questioningly at the floor director, who shook his head slightly, "Keep rolling." In the production booth, technicians exchanged glances. In 15 years of the show, they'd never felt a silence, quite like this one. The production assistant, who should have been preparing for the upcoming commercial break, stood transfixed, clipboard forgotten in her hands. "Should we go to break?" the assistant director whispered into his headset. "Not yet," came the response from the booth. Something's happening here. Oprah, who had built her career on drawing people out, found herself in the unusual position of being drawn in by Chuck's silence. It challenged her in ways she hadn't expected, not with words or arguments, but with the simple power of presence. Her expression shifted subtly. The professional interviewer giving way to genuine curiosity. Those who had watched her show for years might have recognized a rare vulnerability in her posture, a willingness to be affected rather than simply to affect. 3 seats away, the pop star continued to fidget slightly. A man whose career had been built on filling silences with sound, now confronted with the power of quiet. His discomfort was palpable, a counterpoint that only emphasized the unusual dynamic developing between Oprah and Chuck. 20 seconds had passed since Oprah's question. In television time, it might as well have been an eternity. The audience had grown so quiet that the soft mechanical hum of the cameras became audible. The typical shuffling, whispering, and program rustling of a studio audience had ceased entirely. 300 people breathed as one, caught in the gravitational pull of authentic presence. Finally, after what felt like minutes, but was perhaps only 30 seconds total, Chuck spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, each word deliberate, emerging not from the need to fill silence but from a place of considered truth. I don't believe God cares who wins fights. The simplicity of the statement hung in the air. No defensiveness, no attempt to reframe the question, just a straightforward answer that opened rather than closed the conversation. Several audience members nodded unconsciously, responding not just to his words but to the grounded authenticity with which he spoke them. What I believe, he continued, his voice carrying easily despite its quietness, is that God helps me remain centered. In fighting, in acting, in life. The camera caught a close-up of his eyes, clear, focused, present in a way that cut through the artifice of the studio environment. There was something in his gaze that communicated decades of personal discipline, of internal struggle, more demanding than any physical fight portrayed on screen. He leaned forward slightly, his posture relaxed but engaged. When I was younger, I thought strength was about dominance, about imposing your will. A faint smile crossed his face, touched with self-awareness, and perhaps a hint of regret for former limitations. I won a lot of trophies thinking that way, but I lost something more important. The studio was completely silent now. Even the usual subtle movements of an audience, shifting positions, whispered comments, rustling programs had stopped. Every person was locked in a collective moment of unexpected depth. The production team, veterans of thousands of hours of television, recognized that they were capturing something rare, a moment of unmanufactured truth beneath the hot lights of a medium, often criticized for its artificiality. "What did you lose?" Oprah asked, her voice gentler now. Genuine curiosity, replacing the earlier challenge. She had shifted from interviewer to fellow seeker, the question emerging not from her professional role, but from personal resonance with what Chuck was sharing. Chuck's eyes met hers directly, the connection between them authentic, in a way that transcended their public personas. "Peace," he said simply. "Purpose. The understanding that true strength isn't about defeating others. It's about mastering yourself." Brother Samuel nodded almost imperceptibly, recognizing a spiritual truth that transcended any specific religious tradition. In the front row, a woman dabbed at her eye, touched not by celebrity emotion, but by the universal human experience Chuck had articulated. "When I train now," Chuck continued, his voice carrying easily through the hushed studio, "when I fight, when I act, I don't pray for victory. I pray for clarity, for the discipline to use whatever gifts I've been given with humility." The camera caught Oprah's expression as it shifted from professional curiosity to personal engagement. This wasn't the direction she'd expected the segment to take, but her instincts told her they were capturing something authentic, something beyond the practiced exchanges that usually filled talk show minutes. Her own expression had softened, the initial challenge in her question yielding to genuine interest in Chuck's perspective. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. An assistant producer signaled from the side of the stage 1 minute until the scheduled commercial break. The director nodded acknowledgement, but made no move to interrupt the exchange. Some moments in television transcended scheduling. But there's still ego there, isn't there? Oprah pressed. Not confrontationally, but with genuine interest. Her follow-up emerged naturally from the conversation rather than from prepared talking points. The spotlight? The fame? Being Chuck Norris's with all the mythology that comes with it? For the first time, Chuck smiled fully, a warm expression that softened his features and reached his eyes, humanizing the stoic image many associated with him. Every day, he acknowledged, the admission carrying no defensive edge but rather the wisdom of someone who had made peace with ongoing struggle. That's the fight that never ends, Oprah. Not the one in the ring or on camera. The one inside. He tapped his chest lightly, between who the world wants you to be and who you're called to be. The camera caught a young woman in the audience nodding emphatically, perhaps recognizing in Chuck's words a struggle she knew intimately despite the vast differences in their life circumstances. An older man, 2 rows behind her, removed his glasses, wiping them thoughtfully, as though seeing the martial arts star clearly for the first time. In the control room, the director had completely forgotten about the commercial break that should have started 30 seconds ago. The production assistant held up the cue card, indicating they were now officially behind schedule. But she did so half-heartedly, recognizing that ordinary production rhythms had been temporarily suspended in service of something more valuable. In 20 years of producing television, the director had never felt less inclined to cut away from a moment. "We're running over," the assistant director whispered urgently into his headset. "Let it go," came the response from the booth. "We'll adjust the next segment." The studio audience, initially expecting light celebrity banter about faith and fame, found themselves witnesses to something more authentic. The atmosphere had transformed from entertainment to encounter. The usual psychological distance between stage and seats had dissolved into a shared experience that transcended the typical talk show dynamic. Even the lighting seemed different, though no technical changes had been made. The usual harsh studio illumination appeared somehow softer, more intimate, as though the quality of the conversation had altered the physical environment itself. The pop star, still slightly uncomfortable with the depth of the exchange, nevertheless appeared captured by it. His earlier fidgeting replaced by attentive stillness. Oprah felt it too. Her next question came not from her role as host but from her own genuine curiosity. A rare moment where the line between professional and personal had blurred entirely. "And how do you win that fight, Chuck?" she asked quietly, leaning forward slightly. "The internal one?" The question hung in the air, carrying weight beyond the immediate conversation. It touched on something universal, the human struggle for authenticity in a world that often rewards performance over presence, image over substance. In asking it, Oprah had moved from interviewer to fellow pilgrim, acknowledging through her tone and posture that Chuck's answer mattered not just for the audience, but for her own journey as well. The director signaled for another audience shot, capturing the collective attention focused on the stage. The typical restlessness of a studio audience had vanished, replaced by an unusual quality of presence. These weren't just viewers anymore. They had become witnesses to an authentic exchange that had somehow transcended the medium that contained it. A production assistant began quietly adjusting the schedule cards for the remainder of the show. Whatever had been planned would need to be condensed to accommodate this unexpected moment of depth. No one in the production team questioned the decision. There was an unspoken recognition that they were capturing something rare and valuable, something that justified the disruption of carefully planned segments and commercial timing. Chuck took a deep breath, preparing to answer Oprah's question about the internal fight. The camera caught the subtle movement of his chest, the momentary closing of his eyes, not dramatic gestures, but the authentic preparation of a man about to share hard-won wisdom that came not from theory but from lived experience. The studio held its collective breath. 300 people united in a moment of unexpected authenticity, waiting to hear what would come next. "You don't." Chuck's simple response hung in the air, unexpected and yet profound in its honesty. A few audience members exchanged glances, surprise flickering across their faces. This was not the answer they had anticipated from a man whose career had been built on the image of invincibility, whose on-screen persona never lost, never surrendered, never failed. "You don't win it once and for all," he continued, his voice measured and thoughtful. "It's daily. Sometimes it's moment by moment." A cameraman adjusted his focus, capturing the subtle lines around Chuck's eyes. Evidence of years, lived with intensity and purpose. The director signaled for a reaction shot from Oprah, whose expression had transformed from professional curiosity to genuine engagement, her body language mirroring Chuck's openness. He shifted slightly in his seat, his posture remaining open but his expression becoming more reflective, as though accessing memories not often shared publicly. The stage lights caught the silver at his temples, humanizing the legend, transforming the icon into a man with a story to tell. "I remember being stationed in Korea with the Air Force. I was 20 years old, training in Tangsu-do, filled with ambition." A faint smile touched his lips, tinged with the wisdom of retrospect. "And pride. Plenty of that too." The cameras caught Oprah leaning forward, her famous interview posture transforming into something more natural. A person genuinely absorbed in another's story. Her usual role as America's confidant had shifted. She wasn't drawing out a narrative for her audience's consumption, but was herself drawn into an unexpected journey of revelation. In the third row, a middle-aged man nodded in unconscious recognition, perhaps a veteran himself, responding to the authenticity in Chuck's voice. 2 rows behind him, a young woman whispered to her companion, "I had no idea he was in the military." The soft murmur of voices died quickly, everyone eager to hear what would come next. "One night, I was on guard duty. Alone. Middle of winter. So cold, you could feel your thoughts freezing." Chuck's voice remained even, but his eyes carried the weight of the memory, transporting not just himself, but the entire studio back to that distant night in Korea. "I heard something move in the darkness beyond the perimeter. Protocol said to call it in immediately. But I was young, thought I had something to prove." The pop star, who had been fidgeting subtly throughout the serious exchange, grew still now, perhaps recognizing something universal in the story of youthful hubris, despite the vast differences in their life experiences. His expression shifted from performative interest to genuine attention. Brother Samuel watched Chuck intently from his seat, recognizing the contours of a testimony emerging, not the polished kind often shared from pulpits, but the raw variety born of lived experience. His hands remained lightly clasped, his posture suggesting a man accustomed to bearing witness to moments of spiritual significance. I chambered around, moved toward the sound. Chuck paused, the silence heightening the tension of the narrative. The entire audience seemed to hold its breath, transported from the comfortable studio to that cold, dark night decades ago. I was terrified. Though I wouldn't have admitted it then, my hands were shaking not just from the cold. The studio remained utterly silent. Even the usual subtle sounds of production, whispered directions, camera movements, the rustling of papers had stilled. 300 people breathed as one. Collective witnesses to a moment of unexpected vulnerability, from a man many knew only as an unshakable action hero. In the control room, the director gestured for tighter shots, recognizing the rare authenticity unfolding. "Stay with him," he whispered into his headset. "Don't miss a second of this." And then I prayed. Chuck's voice softened, the admission carrying no trace of self-consciousness. Not for victory or protection, though that was part of it. I prayed for clarity, for steady hands, for the wisdom to know what was truly needed in that moment. A woman in the front row nodded slightly, her eyes damp. Behind her, an older gentleman removed his glasses, wiping them carefully, his expression thoughtful. Throughout the audience, people responded not to celebrity but to the universal human experience of facing fear, of seeking strength beyond oneself when personal resources seem insufficient. Chuck looked directly at Oprah, the connection between them transcending their public personas. That's when I realized I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat, my own breathing, my own fear. I forced myself to become still inside and out. The camera caught Oprah's subtle nod, a woman who, despite her vastly different path, understood the challenge and value of finding stillness amid chaos. It was a moment of genuine connection between two people who had spent decades in the spotlight, yet rarely had the opportunity to speak this authentically about the internal journey that paralleled their public success. Chuck's expression softened as he continued. The threat turned out to be a local farmer who had wandered too close to the base. Not an enemy at all, if I had reacted from fear or pride. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Several audience members shifted in their seats, perhaps contemplating their own moments of narrowly avoided disaster, times when impulse nearly overcame wisdom. The universal nature of Chuck's story transcended his specific experience, touching on something everyone in the room could recognize. "That night changed how I understood strength," he continued, his voice gaining a quiet intensity that filled the studio without rising in volume. "God didn't help me win anything. He helped me find stillness when it mattered most. That's what I try to bring to everything now, that centered presence." The camera panned briefly to the audience, capturing expressions of thoughtful engagement. This wasn't the typical talk show audience reaction of entertainment or amusement, but something deeper: recognition, reflection, resonance with their own spiritual questions and struggles. Oprah nodded, processing his words, her expression suggesting she was weighing his perspective against her own experiences. "But when people see your films, your fights, they're seeing dominance, aren't they? Power over others?" The question wasn't challenging but curious, an invitation to reconcile the public image with the private philosophy. It reflected a genuine interest in understanding how Chuck integrated these seemingly contradictory elements of his life. "They're seeing choreography," Chuck replied with a gentle smile that softened the lines of his face. "Art designed to look like dominance. But real power?" He shook his head slightly. "Real power rarely looks impressive from the outside." A murmur of appreciation moved through the audience, not the reactive applause of entertainment, but the deeper recognition of truth resonating with personal experience. An older woman in the second row leaned toward her companion, whispering something that made them both nod in agreement. The camera caught Brother Samuel's expression, eyes slightly damp, nodding in quiet affirmation. His seminary training had taught him these principles intellectually, but here they were embodied in the unlikely form of an action star, articulated not through theological language but through lived experience. "When I teach martial arts now," Chuck continued, his hands moving slightly to emphasize his words, "the first thing students want to learn is how to defeat an opponent. The last thing many of them learn is that defeating others was never the point." The director signaled for a reaction shot from the pop star, whose expression had transformed from the polished celebrity smile to something more contemplative. Perhaps he was considering his own career, his own understanding of power and performance, in light of Chuck's words. In the control room, the production team exchanged glances. The segment had moved far beyond its planned trajectory, yet no one suggested redirecting it. There was an unspoken recognition that they were capturing something rare, a moment of genuine wisdom that transcended the usual boundaries of daytime television. The point was harmony, balance, the discipline to control yourself rather than dominating others. Chuck's voice remained even, but carried a quiet passion that gave weight to each word. That's where faith enters for me. Not in praying for victory, but in seeking the humility to use strength correctly. The camera caught a young man in his 20s, athletic build, the kind who might have come hoping to see the action star demonstrate a roundhouse kick leaning forward in his seat, his expression suggesting Chuck's words were reshaping something fundamental in his understanding of strength. Oprah's expression had transformed completely from her initial challenging posture. She leaned forward, engaged not as a talk show host but as a fellow seeker. The barriers of performance had dissolved, replaced by genuine conversation between two people exploring questions that mattered. "That's beautiful, Chuck," she said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. The words came not from her professional script but from authentic response to what she was witnessing. And yet, she paused, her natural instinct for deeper questions surfacing. There must be moments when that alignment fails. When faith doesn't provide that clarity or peace. The question hung in the air, touching on something more universal than celebrity spirituality, the human experience of doubt, of prayers that seemed to go unanswered, of beliefs tested by reality. It was the kind of question that moved beyond the surface of spiritual discussion to the complicated heart of lived faith. In the audience, several people shifted forward slightly, recognizing the turn toward territory that rarely received honest exploration in public forums. A woman in her 50s nodded almost imperceptibly, perhaps remembering her own moments of spiritual darkness. Beside her, a younger man's expression suggested similar recognition. Different generation. Same human struggle. Chuck's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his typically composed features. For the first time in the interview, he looked not like an action star or martial arts master, but simply like a man who had faced his own darkness. The camera captured the moment perfectly. The slight tension around his eyes, the momentary pause before response, the subtle depth that entered his gaze. "Yes," he acknowledged quietly. "There are those moments too." The simple admission carried more weight than a lengthy philosophical discourse. In 3 words, he had bridged the gap between idealized spirituality and honest faith, between the perfection people projected onto public figures and the complex reality of spiritual life. The stage lights seemed to soften, or perhaps it was just the mood in the studio transforming as the conversation moved from philosophy to lived experience. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing they were witnessing not a performance but a genuine revelation. In the production booth, the assistant director gestured toward the clock. "We're running 7 minutes behind schedule." The director nodded acknowledgement without taking his eyes from the monitors. "We'll cut the final segment if we need to. This is gold." Oprah, with the intuitive timing that had made her the most influential interviewer of her generation, allowed the silence to breathe, creating space for what would come next. Her posture was open, attentive, communicating through body language what words might have disrupted. "I'm listening." Not as a talk show host, as a person. The pop star glanced at his watch, then immediately seemed embarrassed by the gesture, recognizing its inappropriate timing. Brother Samuel remained absolutely still, his expression suggesting a man witnessing something sacred unfolding in an unexpected place. Chuck looked down briefly, then up again, his eyes clear but carrying a depth of emotion rarely displayed publicly. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality of hard-won wisdom, of truth tested through difficulty rather than merely inherited or assumed. "And that's when faith matters most," he said. Not when it brings victory, but when it carries you through defeat. The words resonated through the studio, touching something universal despite their simplicity. Several audience members nodded in unconscious recognition, responding not to celebrity but to shared human experience, the universal journey through doubt, struggle, and resilience. A woman in the front row wiped a tear, not bothering to hide the gesture. Behind her, a man in his 60s sat with unusual stillness, his expression suggesting Chuck's words had touched something deep and perhaps painful in his own experience. Throughout the audience, people responded not as viewers but as fellow travelers on a spiritual journey that included both light and shadow. Faith isn't tested when everything goes according to plan, Chuck continued, his voice steady, but touched with the authenticity that comes only from personal experience. It's tested in the darkness, in confusion, in moments when what you believed doesn't seem to match what you're living. Brother Samuel's eyes closed briefly, his lips moving in what might have been a silent prayer of affirmation. The pop star's earlier fidgeting had ceased entirely. He sat absolutely still, perhaps recognizing wisdom that transcended the differences in their public personas and private beliefs. Oprah's expression reflected not just professional interest but personal resonance. She had built an empire asking questions, yet in this moment she seemed content to witness rather than direct, to receive rather than shape the conversation's flow. Her usual position of gentle authority had yielded to genuine receptivity. There's a strength that comes only through weakness, Chuck said, meeting Oprah's gaze directly. A peace that arrives not when prayers are answered the way we want, but when we find ourselves held, even when they're not. The camera caught the subtle nod of recognition from a woman in the second row, gray-haired, dignified, her expression suggesting she knew intimately the truth of what Chuck described. 2 rows behind her, a younger woman dabbed at her eyes, perhaps connecting Chuck's words to her own struggles. Throughout the studio, the artificial boundary between celebrity and audience had dissolved, replaced by a shared human moment that transcended entertainment. They were no longer watching Chuck Norris, action star. They were witnessing Chuck Norris, fellow pilgrim, on a spiritual journey that included both certainty and doubt, both strength and vulnerability. In the control room, the production team watched in unusual silence. Professionals momentarily transformed into witnesses by the authentic exchange unfolding on their monitors. The usual calculations of ratings and segments and timing had yielded to recognition of something rarer and more valuable. In martial arts, Chuck continued, his hands opening slightly in a gesture of offering rather than assertion, we train to maintain balance when everything around us is in chaos. Faith works the same way for me, not removing the chaos, but helping me find my center within it. Brother Samuel nodded, perhaps recognizing in Chuck's words echoes of ancient spiritual traditions expressed through the language of modern experience. The pop star's expression had transformed from polished celebrity to genuine attention, suggesting Chuck's words were penetrating the careful artifice of public persona. And that center holds, Chuck said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. Even when nothing else makes sense, even when prayers seem unanswered, even when the path disappears. The camera panned slowly across the audience, capturing expressions of recognition, reflection, resonance. This wasn't entertainment, it was communion, a shared exploration of questions that transcended the usual boundaries of daytime television. Oprah's next question emerged, not from her role as interviewer, but from genuine curiosity, from her own spiritual journey, intersecting with the unexpected depths of their conversation. And how do you find that center again? She asked softly. When you've lost it. When the doubts seem stronger than the faith, the question hung in the air, weighted with universal significance. It wasn't just Oprah asking. It was every person who had ever struggled to reconcile belief with experience, faith with doubt, spiritual ideals with human reality. Chuck's expression reflected thoughtful consideration, a man taking the question as seriously as it deserved. His response, when it came, would bridge the gap between philosophical abstraction and lived experience, between spiritual ideal and human struggle. The studio held its collective breath, waiting for words that might illuminate their own paths through darkness. I lost a good friend in 1970. Chuck's voice remained steady, but a new quality entered it. A resonance of old grief, long processed but never forgotten. Carlos was a training partner, brother in many ways, car accident after a tournament. The studio lights seemed to dim, though they hadn't actually changed. Something in the atmosphere shifted as Chuck spoke about loss rather than victory, vulnerability rather than strength. The audience, who had come expecting celebrity banter, found themselves witnesses to something more authentic. A man speaking not from his public persona, but from the depths of lived experience. Carlos and I trained together for 3 years. Chuck continued, his gaze distant now, seeing not the studio but memories from decades past. He pushed me, challenged me, had this laugh you could hear across the dojo. A faint smile touched his lips, then faded. We were coming back from a competition in San Diego. Different cars. He never made it home. Several audience members nodded in unconscious recognition of grief's universal language. An older man in the 4th row removed his glasses, polishing them unnecessarily. A middle-aged woman in the front pressed her hand briefly to her heart. Throughout the studio, people connected not to celebrity, but to shared human experience, the inescapable encounter with loss that shapes every life. I'd been praying for his recovery every hour of every day, believing, truly believing he would pull through. Chuck's gaze was distant now, seeing not the studio but a hospital room from decades past. When he died, I was angry. Not just grieving, but angry at God. A few audience members nodded in unconscious recognition. The universal experience of unanswered prayers, of faith tested by suffering. A young woman in the 3rd row wiped quickly at her eye. 2 seats away from her, an older gentleman's expression suggested he knew intimately the spiritual crisis Chuck described. Oprah remained completely still, her famous ability to draw out guests now replaced by the simple power of attentive presence. She didn't need to guide this moment. She simply needed to witness it. Her usual posture of gentle authority had yielded to one of receptive listening. Not America's host, but a fellow human recognizing the sacred territory of another's pain. I stopped training for months, Chuck continued, his voice carrying no shame in the admission. Stopped praying too. What was the point, I thought, if faith couldn't save someone like Carlos? Someone good, with so much to offer the world? Brother Samuel's eyes closed briefly, his expression one of deep understanding. The pop star, who had been fidgeting slightly throughout the serious turn in conversation, grew still as well, perhaps recognizing something beyond the usual celebrity discourse. His expression suggested Chuck's words had penetrated the carefully maintained facade of entertainment, touching something universal that transcended their different worlds. I went through the motions, Chuck said, his candor cutting through the artificial environment of television. Taught my classes, showed up at the gym, but inside, he tapped his chest lightly. There was just this silence, this emptiness where faith had been. The camera caught a tear, forming in the corner of one audience member's eye. Though Chuck himself remained composed, his vulnerability evident not in emotional display, but in his willingness to share authentic experience. Throughout the studio, people responded not to celebrity but to the universal human struggle with doubt, with questions that have no easy answers. with the painful gap between spiritual ideal and lived reality. Then one morning, I was watching the sunrise from my porch, not thinking about God or Carlos or anything specific. Chuck's voice softened, and I felt something I can't quite explain, a presence, a peace that made no logical sense given how angry I still was. The director signaled for a close-up, capturing the subtle shift in Chuck's expression, a man describing something deeply personal yet universal, something that transcended language yet needed to be shared. The audience leaned forward collectively, sensing they were witnessing not performance but testimony, not entertainment but communion. It wasn't a voice or a vision, he clarified, his tone matter-of-fact. Just a deep certainty that Carlos was okay, that I would be too, that my anger didn't diminish God's reality any more than clouds erase the Sunday. Oprah nodded, her expression reflecting not just professional interest, but personal resonance. Perhaps she was remembering her own moments of unexpected grace, her own experiences of finding light in darkness. The connection between them transcended their public roles, touching something deeper, the shared human journey through doubt and renewal. I went back to my dojo that afternoon. Chuck continued, his hands opening slightly in a gesture that suggested surrender rather than victory. Not because I had answers, but because I realized the questions themselves were part of faith, not separate from it. A murmur of appreciation moved through the audience, not the reactive applause of entertainment, but the deeper recognition of wisdom, hard-won through experience. An elderly woman nodded emphatically, perhaps seeing her own spiritual journey reflected in Chuck's words. He looked directly at Oprah. That's what many people misunderstand about belief. They think faith means certainty, when often it's about continuing the journey, even when the path disappears. The camera caught the subtle nod of a young man in the back row dressed casually. Perhaps not someone who would identify as religious, yet clearly recognizing the truth in Chuck's words. Beside him, an older woman dabbed at her eyes, her expression suggesting Chuck had articulated something she had felt but never heard expressed. Brother Samuel broke his long silence. "That's when faith is real," he said softly, his voice carrying surprising strength despite its gentleness. "Not when it's easy, but when it costs something." Chuck nodded in appreciation of the minister's insight, the exchange between them bridging the gap between formal religion and lived spirituality. The camera captured the moment perfectly. Two men from different worlds, finding common ground in the territory of authentic faith. In the production booth, the director signaled for a wide shot, wanting to capture the collective attention of the audience. The usual restlessness of a studio crowd, the shifting, the whispering, the program checking, had disappeared entirely. 300 people breathed as one, united by their recognition of something true being spoken in a medium often criticized for its artificiality. Oprah, sensing the depth of the moment, asked the question that many in the audience were likely contemplating. "And how do you maintain that faith through the silence, Chuck? When prayers seem unanswered, when God feels distant?" The question hung in the air, touching something universal. The inevitable seasons of spiritual darkness. The times when belief seems more like choice than certainty. Throughout the audience, people leaned forward slightly, recognizing the question as their own, regardless of their specific religious tradition or lack thereof. For a moment, Chuck seemed to be considering whether to share something even more personal. His expression remained composed, but those watching closely might have noticed a subtle shift in his breathing, a momentary closing of his eyes, the invisible preparation for revealing another layer of truth. "My son Eric was born with a rare genetic condition," he said finally, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a father's love. "The doctors gave us little hope initially. My wife and I prayed constantly for healing, for a miracle." The studio was utterly silent, Even the typically bustling production staff stood motionless at the edges of the set, papers forgotten in their hands, headsets momentarily ignored. The usual machinery of television had yielded to the power of authentic human connection. The miracle didn't come in the form we expected, Chuck continued, his expression softening with what could only be described as a father's pride. Eric wasn't healed in the way we initially prayed for. But something else happened, something I wouldn't trade for anything. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her mouth, visibly moved. Behind her, a young couple held hands tightly. Perhaps parents themselves. Recognizing the terrain Chuck was describing. Throughout the audience, people responded not to celebrity, but to the universal experiences of love, fear, hope, and transformation. Eric taught me more about strength than all my years of martial arts. About joy that doesn't depend on circumstances. About loving life exactly as it comes to you. A few audience members wiped tears now, no longer concerned with appearances. The pop star beside Chuck looked down, perhaps confronting his own thoughts about authenticity versus image. His usual polished veneer had cracked, revealing something more human beneath a young man. Perhaps recognizing for the first time that true strength often looks nothing like its portrayal in entertainment. That experience transformed my understanding of prayer, Chuck said, his voice carrying quiet certainty. I stopped asking God to change situations and started asking Him to change me instead, to give me the strength to face whatever comes with grace. The camera panned across the audience, capturing expressions of recognition and resonance. A middle-aged man nodded slowly, his expression suggesting Chuck's words had articulated something he had lived but never expressed. Beside him, a younger woman dabbed at her eyes, perhaps connecting Chuck's wisdom to her own struggles. Oprah nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. That's a profound shift, she acknowledged, her voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than professional polish. From seeing prayer as a way to control outcomes to seeing it as surrender. Chuck finished quietly. Not passive resignation, but active trust. The paradoxical understanding that true strength often comes through vulnerability. He glanced briefly at Brother Samuel, who nodded in affirmation, perhaps recognizing in Chuck's words echoes of ancient spiritual traditions expressed through the language of modern experience. The connection between them bridged the gap between formal religion and lived spirituality. Between pulpit wisdom and hard-won personal truth, there's a scripture that says, "When I am weak, then I am strong," Chuck continued. I didn't understand that fully until I had to let go of my ideas about how life should unfold and embrace what was actually unfolding. The camera caught Oprah's expression, thoughtful, moved, and perhaps slightly unsettled by the unexpected depth of the conversation. This wasn't the interview she had prepared for, but it was arguably more authentic than most exchanges that happened under studio lights. Her usual role as guide had yielded to that of fellow seeker, exploring territory that transcended entertainment. In my films, Chuck said with a slight smile, acknowledging the elephant in the room, the hero always wins through force of will or superior skill. But real life has taught me that true victory often looks like surrender, like acceptance, like finding peace within circumstances you would never have chosen. Brother Samuel spoke again, his voice gentle yet clear, carrying the authority of both theological training and personal experience. That's the heart of faith, not getting what you want, but discovering what you need in the midst of what you didn't want at all. The audience remained motionless, collectively held in a moment that had transcended entertainment and entered the realm of shared human experience. The usual boundaries between celebrity and viewer, between stage and seats, had dissolved, replaced by recognition of common journey despite different paths. In the control room, The director had long since abandoned thoughts of commercial breaks or segment timing. Some moments in television couldn't be manufactured or contained within familiar formats. This was one of them. A rare convergence of authenticity and visibility, of depth and reach, of personal truth and universal resonance. Oprah, with the intuitive sense that had made her America's most trusted confidant, recognized that the conversation had reached a natural turning point. What had begun as a somewhat challenging question about faith and fighting had opened into a profound exploration of strength, surrender, and resilience. "Chuck," she said finally, her voice carrying a warmth that wasn't performance but genuine connection, "you came here today to talk about faith and power. I think what you're describing is a different kind of power than most of us are conditioned to recognize." Chuck stood quietly at the center of the power stage, his presence filling the space without effort or intention. The audience watched in curious silence, unsure what was happening but collectively sensing a shift in the atmosphere, from conversation to demonstration, from words to embodiment. His movement had been unexpected, unscripted, breaking the familiar rhythm of the interview format. 300 people held their breath, unified in their attention, witnessing something that transcended the usual boundaries of daytime television. He glanced toward Oprah, a silent request for permission to take this unscripted turn. She nodded, her curiosity evident in the slight tilt of her head, the focused attentiveness in her eyes. The floor director looked questioningly toward the control booth, where the producer simply shrugged. Whatever was happening wasn't in the segment plan, but instinct told him it shouldn't be stopped. "We going off script?" The assistant director whispered into his headset. "Let it happen," came the reply. "Just follow him with camera 2. "May I show you something?" Chuck asked, his voice carrying easily despite having set aside his microphone. The acoustics of the studio seemed to amplify his words, or perhaps it was simply that every person was listening with unusual intensity. Oprah gestured openly with a fluid motion of her hand. "Please." The word carried not just permission but invitation, a recognition that they had moved beyond the territory of planned television into something more authentic. Chuck stepped into an open area of the stage, his movements fluid and deliberate, carrying the disciplined grace of decades of martial arts training. The studio lights caught his form as he assumed a traditional stance. Feet planted firmly, posture balanced, hands relaxed at his sides. Nothing showy or dramatic, just centered presence. A young man in the front row leaned forward, perhaps anticipating an impressive demonstration of physical skill. 2 rows behind him, an older woman watched with quiet interest, her expression suggesting she sensed there was more to this moment than mere physical display. "In martial arts," Chuck began, his voice carrying a teacher's clarity, "beginners believe fighting is about striking, about force meeting force." He demonstrated a series of rapid punches and kicks that elicited murmurs of appreciation from the audience, the movements precise, powerful, impressive to watch. A teenage boy nudged his friend, clearly impressed by the display. Several audience members nodded appreciatively, witnessing the physical prowess that had made Chuck a global action star. The cameras captured the sequence perfectly, the director calling for multiple angles to ensure they documented the unexpected demonstration. In the control booth, the production team watched with professional appreciation. This was exactly the kind of memorable television moment that would be replayed for years. "This is what most people think of as strength," Chuck said, returning to center position, his breathing perfectly controlled, despite the exertion of the demonstration. "Action, domination, visible power." He paused, allowing the contrast to build between the dynamic movement he had just displayed and the centered stillness he now embodied. The juxtaposition was powerful physical capability meeting disciplined restraint. Chuck's expression remained thoughtful, focused. But the true masters understand something different. He invited Brother Samuel to join him. A request the minister accepted with slight surprise but willing participation. The older man rose from his seat, moving somewhat self-consciously toward the center of the stage. His posture carried both dignity and a certain awkwardness, clearly unfamiliar with being part of such a physical demonstration, yet trusting the purpose behind it. The audience stirred slightly, intrigued by this unexpected pairing, the action star and the minister. Physical power and spiritual authority, now sharing the same space. A woman in the third row whispered something to her companion, who nodded in response, both their expressions reflecting engaged curiosity. "If Brother Samuel attacks me," Chuck nodded encouragingly to the minister, who made a hesitant, almost comical attempt at a punch. His movement carried none of the precision or power of Chuck's earlier demonstration, yet it served its purpose perfectly. The audience chuckled softly, the gentle laughter breaking some of the emotional tension that had built during the previous segment. The sound rippled through the studio, not mocking but appreciative recognition of the minister's good-natured participation in something outside his usual domain. Chuck didn't block or counterattack. Instead, he simply wasn't there when the punch arrived, having shifted his position with such subtle efficiency that it appeared almost magical. No strain, no dramatic movement, just absence where presence had been expected. The audience's response shifted from amusement to something deeper, a collective intake of breath that suggested recognition of something profound being demonstrated through simple movement. This wasn't just physical skill, it was philosophy embodied, wisdom made visible. The highest form of mastery isn't about opposing force, Chuck explained as Brother Samuel returned to his seat, the minister nodding with newfound understanding. It's about being so centered that you remain unaffected by external pressure. About maintaining inner peace regardless of outer circumstance. A woman in the front row nodded slowly, her expression suggesting Chuck's words had connected with something in her own experience, perhaps not martial arts, but the universal human challenge of finding peace amid chaos, centeredness amid disruption. He returned to center stage, his posture relaxed yet poised, embodying the principle he was describing. The camera caught the moment perfectly, not just a celebrity giving an interview, but a man living his philosophy under the artificial lights of a television studio. "This is what faith looks like to me," he continued, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "Not a weapon to achieve victory, but a center that holds steady through both victory and defeat." Throughout the audience, people responded not to celebrity, but to wisdom, not to performance, but to authenticity. An elderly man in the fifth row nodded emphatically, perhaps recognizing in Chuck's words echoes of his own spiritual journey. Beside him, a young woman watched with unusual stillness. Her expression suggesting something in this demonstration was reshaping her understanding of both strength and faith. Chuck closed his eyes briefly, his breathing visibly slowing. The studio grew so quiet that the subtle sound of the air conditioning became noticeable. 300 people watched in collective silence as he demonstrated not physical power, but centered presence, the capacity to be fully present in the moment, neither reaching for the future nor dwelling in the past. "The Bible speaks of the peace that passes understanding," he said, eyes still closed. That's not poetic language. It's a practical reality available to anyone who learns to be still, to listen, to trust something beyond their own strength. Brother Samuel's expression reflected deep recognition, perhaps hearing familiar scripture transformed from theological concept to lived reality. The pop star, who had maintained a careful distance from the spiritual turn in the conversation, now watched with undisguised interest, his typical celebrity polish yielding to genuine curiosity. In the control room, the director signaled for reaction shots, wanting to capture the unusual quality of attention that had settled over the studio. This wasn't the familiar energy of entertainment, the excited response to celebrity or performance, but something deeper. Collective witness to authentic wisdom. When Chuck opened his eyes again, they carried a clarity and presence that the cameras captured perfectly, a man fully inhabiting himself, neither performing nor hiding. The moment transcended the artificial environment of television, creating a space of unusual authenticity beneath the hot studio lights. "In my movies," he said with a slight smile that acknowledged the irony, "I defeat enemies through force. In my life, I've learned that the greatest battles are won through surrender, through letting go of the ego's need to control outcomes." The camera caught a young man in his 20s, nodding slowly, perhaps recognizing wisdom that contradicted everything his culture had taught him about strength and success. Beside him, an older woman dabbed at her eyes, moved not by sentimentality but by recognition of truth expressed with unusual clarity. Chuck looked directly at Oprah, their connection transcending their public personas. "To answer your original question more completely, no, I don't believe God helps me win fights. I believe God teaches me which fights are worth engaging in and which ones are just the ego grasping for validation." The statement hung in the air, its simplicity carrying the weight of wisdom earned through years of both physical discipline and spiritual practice. Throughout the audience, people responded not to celebrity, but to authenticity. The rare experience of hearing someone speak from lived truth rather than rehearsed opinion. Chuck returned to his seat, the demonstration complete. The movement carried no drama or flourish, just the same centered presence that had characterized the entire demonstration. He settled beside Brother Samuel, his posture relaxed but attentive. The audience remained silent for a moment, then began to applaud not the performative enthusiasm of typical talk show responses, but something more genuine. A recognition of authentic sharing rather than entertainment. The sound built gradually, an organic expression of appreciation rather than the cued reaction typical of studio audiences. Brother Samuel leaned toward Chuck, just within range of his microphone, and said softly, "That's faith in motion." The simple phrase captured perfectly what had just transpired. Not discussion of faith, but its embodiment. Not theory, but practice. Not words about spiritual reality, but its visible demonstration. Oprah watched this exchange. Her expression, one of genuine appreciation. She had conducted thousands of interviews in her career, but moments of true authenticity remained rare, moments when the cameras and lights and audience seemed to fall away, leaving only human connection in their place. The usual rhythm of television, the practiced pace of question and answer, of entertainment and commercial break, had yielded to something that couldn't be scheduled or scripted, authentic presence cutting through the artifice of media. "I think," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of realization, "that's the answer we were looking for all along." The red recording light blinked off. The stage manager's voice carried across the studio. "We're clear. Back in 3 minutes." The spell that had held the studio in collective attention began to dissolve as the mechanisms of television production reasserted themselves. Crew members moved quickly across the stage, adjusting equipment and preparing for the final segment. The audience stirred. A gentle murmur of conversation, replacing the profound silence of moments before. But this wasn't the typical between segments energy of a talk show. The conversations erupting throughout the studio carried unusual intensity. People turning to strangers beside them to process what they had just witnessed. A middle-aged woman in the second row was visibly emotional, explaining to her seatmate how Chuck's words about his son had connected with her own experience. 2 rows behind her, a college-aged man who had come expecting entertainment was now engaged in earnest discussion with an elderly gentleman about the nature of strength and humility. On stage, the production assistants worked efficiently around the guests, adjusting microphones and checking lighting. But their movements carried a different quality, more respectful, less hurried, as though conscious they were moving through the afterglow of something significant. Oprah leaned toward Chuck as a makeup artist quickly powdered her forehead. "That wasn't what I expected when we booked this segment," she said, her voice carrying genuine appreciation rather than the practiced warmth of a host. Her usual professional mask had slipped, revealing the woman behind the media empire, someone still capable of being surprised, of being moved, of learning. Chuck smiled slightly. "It wasn't what I expected either," he admitted. The line around his eyes softened, his usual composed expression yielding to something more open. But sometimes the most honest conversations are the unplanned ones. The makeup artist moved away, having completed her touch-ups. But her usual efficiency was tempered by something like reverence. She had worked hundreds of shows, touched up countless celebrities. Yet something in her manner suggested she recognized this moment as different. Not just television, but truth. Brother Samuel nodded in agreement, his eyes still reflecting the impact of what had transpired. "Truth has its own timing," he said softly. "Its own way of emerging when the moment is right." The minister had come expecting to be overshadowed by the more famous guests, yet found himself an integral part of something unexpectedly authentic. The floor director approached, clipboard in hand, her usual brisk efficiency slightly softened. "Miss Winfrey, we've adjusted the final segment. The producers think we should continue with this discussion rather than moving to the pre-planned questions about the charity work." It was a significant departure from the carefully structured flow of daytime television, where segments were planned, timed, and executed with precision. The decision to abandon the prepared material spoke volumes about the unusual power of what had unfolded. Oprah nodded her understanding, a subtle appreciation in her expression for the production team's sensitivity to the moment. After what had just transpired, returning to scripted talking points would feel jarring, inauthentic. The conversation had created its own momentum, following a path more meaningful than the one they had mapped out in pre-production meetings. In the back of the studio, the executive producer stood with arms crossed, watching the activity on stage with thoughtful attention. He had overseen thousands of episodes, had a finely tuned sense for ratings and audience engagement, yet his expression suggested something beyond professional calculation recognition, that they had captured something rare and valuable. Beside him, an intern whispered, "I've never seen anything like that on the show before." Her voice carried the awe of someone new to the industry, still capable of being moved rather than jaded by the machinery of entertainment. The producer shook his head slightly. "Because it wasn't on the show, in the usual sense," he replied. His tone carried the wisdom of decades in television, the ability to distinguish between manufactured moments and authentic ones. "For a few minutes there, everybody forgot the cameras. That's rare." He chuckled softly. "And it's why we'll probably win an Emmy for this episode." On stage, the pop star was engaged in animated conversation with Chuck, the earlier awkwardness replaced by genuine curiosity. The careful image he had maintained throughout the show, the practiced smile, the camera-ready posture had yielded to something more authentic. "How do you stay so centered?" he asked, leaning closer to Chuck, his voice lowered as though sharing a confidence rather than performing. "Especially in Hollywood, where everything pushes you toward the ego." It was a question that revealed much about the young man's own struggles, the challenges of maintaining authenticity in an industry built on image and persona. Perhaps Chuck's demonstration had offered a glimpse of a different way to navigate fame, one built on substance rather than appearance. Chuck considered the question thoughtfully, giving it the same careful attention he had shown throughout the conversation. "Daily practice," he replied. His answer carried no hint of platitude or easy solution, just the hard-won wisdom of decades balancing public image with private integrity. Meditation, prayer, physical discipline, they're all connected. The body trains the mind. The mind prepares the spirit. The young star nodded slowly, perhaps recognizing both the simplicity and the challenge in Chuck's response. No magic solution, just the consistent discipline of choosing substance over appearance, depth over surface, day after day. Nearby, a small cluster of audience members had gathered at the edge of the stage, hoping for autographs or photos during the break. But their demeanor was different from the usual celebrity enthusiasm, more thoughtful, almost reverent. They waited patiently, their expressions suggesting they sought not just a signature, but a moment of connection with something authentic they had witnessed. One woman held not a photo to be signed, but a small notebook where she had written something during Chuck's demonstration. Her expression carried unusual intensity, suggesting what she had witnessed had touched something deep and perhaps painful in her own experience. "Mr. Norris," she said hesitantly when he approached, "I've been struggling with my faith lately, questioning everything. What you shared today." She paused, visibly emotional, searching for words adequate to express her response. "It reminded me that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about finding peace within the questions." Chuck's response was simple, but heartfelt. "That's a wisdom many never discover," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect for her insight. No platitudes, no empty reassurance. Just recognition of a fellow traveler on a spiritual journey that included both certainty and doubt. The floor director's voice cut through the moment. "1 minute. Places. Please." The familiar rhythms of television production reasserted themselves, the countdown to cameras rolling, the positioning of guests, the final checks of equipment. Yet beneath the familiar mechanism, something had shifted. The usual tension of live production had been replaced by a different energy, more focused, more present, more aligned with the authentic exchange that had unfolded. As the audience returned to their seats and the guests readjusted their microphones, a subtle but significant shift was evident in the studio atmosphere. The typical energy of a talk show, the controlled enthusiasm, the performance aspect of public conversation had been replaced by something more authentic. The fourth wall that typically separated television production from genuine human connection had dissolved, at least temporarily. The pop star settled into his seat, his posture noticeably different, less posed, more natural. Brother Samuel arranged himself with the quiet dignity that had characterized his presence throughout, though his eyes carried a new depth after participating in Chuck's demonstration. The production assistants moved with unusual care, as though conscious they were serving something beyond entertainment. Oprah took her position, but her posture was different, more relaxed, less the practiced pose of America's host, and more the natural stance of a person engaged in meaningful conversation. The change wasn't dramatic, but to those who had watched her show for years, it was noticeable, the subtle shift from performance to presence. 15 seconds, called the floor director. In those final moments before the cameras reactivated, Chuck caught Oprah's eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired between them. Not host and guest, but two human beings who had momentarily stepped outside their public personas to engage with questions that mattered. Oprah returned the nod, her expression reflecting genuine gratitude for all her success, for all the thousands of interviews she had conducted. Moments of authentic connection remained rare, and precious islands of truth in the carefully constructed world of entertainment. And we're back in 3, 2. The red light blinked on. The final segment began, continuing the conversation about faith, strength, and authenticity. But something had changed, not just in the content of the discussion, but in its quality. The words flowed more naturally, the responses less calculated, the silences more comfortable. The audience, too, had transformed from spectators to participants, from consumers of entertainment to witnesses of truth. Their attention carried a different quality, more focused, more present, more engaged with substance rather than surface. When the episode finally concluded, The applause that filled the studio carried a different tone from the show's beginning. Not the excitement of celebrity proximity, but appreciation for a shared experience that had unexpectedly touched something deeper. As the audience filed out, conversations continued, not about Chuck's famous roundhouse kick or Oprah's latest book selection, but about faith, doubt, strength, and vulnerability. About the moments in their own lives when beliefs had been tested, when prayers had seemed unanswered, when strength had come through surrender rather than control. A middle-aged man walking up the aisle turned to the stranger beside him. "I came to see Chuck Norris," he said, shaking his head slightly in wonder. "But I think I just saw something a lot more important." The woman nodded in understanding. "Me too," she replied quietly. "Me too." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.